Hello, everybody. It's great to have us all here. I'm excited for our chat today, where we've got Kenneth McIntosh, author of Water from an Ancient Well, as well as many other books, and Tony Marshall Griffiths, who's a regular in our community and someone I spend a lot of time talking about these things with. So yeah, our topic today, we wanted to look at Celtic Christianity from the perspective of what it means to be Celtic Christian in the modern world and what it meant to be a Celtic Christian in the medieval world. And all three of us are moderators in the Celtic Christianity Facebook group that we've set up and run. It was Kenneth's idea, and we jumped on board, and it's gone really well. I feel really happy about it. So maybe before we hop into our topic, we'll do just some quick introductions. Most of you probably know I'm Justin Coutts. I live in Canada on Manitoulin Island. I'm a spiritual director and a writer with a focus on Celtic Christianity, but also Christian monasticism in general. And I have a wife and two kids, one of who is about to turn 12 and one of whom turned 1 yesterday. So yeah, I guess that's a little bit on me. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Kenneth McIntosh, and I'm the pastor at a United Church of Christ Church in Western New York State. I have a wife of more than 4 decades, and I have 2 children in their late 30s. And I've had the good fortune to write about a dozen books on Celtic spirituality that are you can find them all on Anam Books publisher. And I've had the extreme good privilege of being able to travel. I've done some long distance walking pilgrimage, and I've done webinars and seminars, retreats in the UK and the US. And I'm just really appreciate Tony and Justin and other folks who make this online forum available and moderate it and, make it the quality source of information and spirited exchanges that it is.
I'm Tony Marshall Griffiths. Thanks for the introduction, Justin. I'm a civil servant by profession, and I live in the north of England. And I have 2 just grown children who are 18 and 20, and who are beautiful young people just starting to make their way in the world, which is a privilege to see. And I think that the main thing that ties me to Celtic Christianity and the Facebook group that we have is my childhood in Wales. I left Wales at the age of 18 to come to university, but Wales has never really left me. Keep getting drawn back and circling back to the place and the landscape and the language and the stories and the saints and the legends. And that connection to Wales is probably my kind of first point of contact with the world of Celtic Christianity. So I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. So I had picked a short little passage from the Penitential of Cummean, and I'll give a little bit of context to it before I read it, and then I'll tell you why I like it, and how I hope it will relate to our conversation here. So a penitential is a book with a collection of penances in it. And penance is a concept in the modern world that often has a different connotation than it had in its original context. Penance gets associated with punishment and a sort of sense of self-loathing and those sorts of things in a lot of people's minds, or hating the body, or those kinds of things that we often associate with it. But in its historical context, it wasn't about that at all. It was actually about restorative justice, so to speak. It was a way to heal the soul. And a good example of that, I think, or probably the best example, would be the Penitential of Cummean. And he opens his prologue saying, or opens his penitential saying, "Here is a prologue on the collection of medicines for the healing of souls and the salvation of human beings. It's a paraphrase. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something very close to that. And so there's this idea in the penitential tradition that it's meant to be medicine, and medicine is very much the language used repeatedly and in depth. So that a penance is a spiritual practice that heals the soul. And in Cummean's penitential, the word medicine has a really diverse set of uses, and he lays out a bunch of them. And it ranges from baptism, sacraments of the church, to having a good cry, to giving something to the poor. And so really anything that that heals us can be called a medicine in that tradition. Yeah, so that's a bit of context on the penitential tradition. And then here I'll read, this is from Finian, a different penitential than Cummean. And you'll see when I read it that he's talking about remedies, and that's what he means. So at the end of his penitential, he says, "These few things concerning the remedies of penance, my dearly beloved brethren, according to the pronouncement of Scripture and to the opinion of some very learned men, I have tried to write down, compelled by love of you, beyond my ability and authority. There are still other authoritative decisions concerning either the remedies or the several kinds of people who are to be cured, which now concern for brevity or the situation of the place or the poverty of my talent does not permit me to set down. But if any diligent searcher of divine reading should for himself find out more, or bring forth and write down better things, we too shall agree and follow him." And so there's a lot of things I love about this, but the key pieces that I wanted to look at were the way he describes his own inability to complete the task. And he doesn't present his penitential as something set in stone that will be that way forever. And in fact, he explicitly says in the last sentence that he hopes someone else will come along and do a better job so that he can follow that person instead. And the reasons he gives 3 reasons. One is a concern for brevity. And I think that's a really interesting point, because as the image of God, I like to think that the human soul is infinite and infinitely knowable. And so while we can write things that are true about what it means to be human, we can never write everything that's true about what it means to be human. And I think that's part of what Finian's getting at there, that there wasn't space in his book to talk about everything. And so we need to have open minds. Secondly, he talks about the context in which we live, the place in which the penitential is found. And I think that's really important too, because the kinds of practices that will help us to heal, that will be true medicines for us, aren't always going to be the same in every time and place. People change, things change. You know, and I think that's really important, especially as we talk about the contemporary Celtic Christianity and how it relates to medieval Celtic Christianity, to see that even in the medieval time, someone like Finian was saying like, hey, this is my context, you know, what's it going to be like in yours? And then the last point that he makes that I wanted to highlight was, he says the poverty of his talent is another reason that we need to continue developing the tradition and not just leave it the way he's written it down. And I think that's really important, you know, because we all have to have that kind of humility to realize that, you know, we're doing the best we can, but that doesn't mean we've got it all figured out or that we have a perfect knowledge of things. And that's the final reason he gives. And then he says, so I hope someone else can come along and teach me more wise things and I can continue to grow. So yeah, that's my my sort of little spiel, why I picked that reading and why I like it. Yeah, and maybe I'll pass it over to you, Kenneth. I know you had some thoughts and things to share as well.
In my book, Water from an Ancient Well, I have a chapter on asceticism, which and we'll get into this discussion later about, what we know from primary sources in the early Middle Ages, as opposed to what people are really into with Celtic spirituality now. But at the time I wrote my book, there have been many other excellent books, but few of them touched on the topic of ascetic practices, because it's not really a popular, you're not going to get tons of people for a seminar on that topic now. But so I use the metaphor in this chapter about, pretend that you go to a health club. You want to get in shape. I'm joining a health club. It's winter, we live in the Midwest. It's all snowy. And you show up and everyone's sitting around watching screens with pictures of people exercising, or they're reading magazines about outdoor sports, or they're having a happy conversation about how it's best to work out, but no one's on the machines. No one's jogging, no one's weight pulling, no one's doing anything physical. And you're like, what is this? And then someone says, oh, that's old-fashioned health club stuff. We don't really want to work up a sweat. We don't like to use our muscles. We don't want to work. We just want to enjoy the benefits and by vicariously. And you go, these people are bonkers. But there's no doubt we should have some regard for the wisdom of the ancients. And in the early Middle Ages, certainly spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, spiritual sweating and working out was a big part of it. And so, like you said, Justin, it's the sort of thing which is caricatured, and even in the high Middle Ages, it was taken to extremes. But we don't have to do that for the benefits. I also think it's interesting that the earliest existent vernacular Irish prose writing that exists is from the 7th century, and it's the Cambrai homily, and it's a homily about spiritual practice. Well, it's about what he calls glass, G-O-A-S, glass martyrdom. We interpret that as green martyrdom usually, and green martyrdom has become kind of a popular expression in Celtic Christianity. We don't know if it's green or blue, because curiously the colors were the same in the ancient world, but green or blue martyrdom is what this homily is about. And it's basically ascetic practice. And the Cambrai homily gives two reasons for it. One is for the development of one's soul, just straight up, holiness. But the other is for the love of neighbor, to choose not to have certain things in order to share. It's a very early statement of that phrase that became popular some decades ago, to live simply so that others may simply live. That's what it's talking about. And I thought it was interesting that asceticism isn't just for individual self, but it has communal value as well. I'd welcome others' thoughts.
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me, really, from what you're saying, Justin, is just the point that scholars like Thomas O'Loughlin make, which is that penitential literature is one of the things which is genuinely distinctive about that early Irish church. That it's one of the things which really does kind of characterise its the character of what that church was, and it's one of these sort of innovations which attaches to that church. I mean, the contrast which O'Loughlin makes is with the practice of penance in the early Mediterranean churches, where there's very much a sense that baptism, conferred a sense of sanctity for life, and that if you fell from that sanctity, if you had any kind of moral lapse, it was a catastrophe, it was a shipwreck, and it turned out it was quite common that people would fall from the grace of baptism. So the church devised means of penance and restoration, but it was very much a model of public penance. There'd be a public sort of declaration of your faults and a public making of amends before you could be restored to the church. And I mean, we talk a lot about how the Irish Church has its roots in the desert, in Evagrius and Cassian, and they start to develop more of the practice of private penance, which you then see in this kind of extensive literary expression in the Irish Church. And there's a whole sort of shift in model in terms of, you know, the sort of need for remedy being an exceptional thing in that idea of public penance. It kind of shifts so that actually, you know, there's that recognition that we're all in need of remedy, that we're all on an ongoing journey of transformation and sanctification as we follow the spiritual path. And the you know, the penitential literature is all about that ongoing journey of healing, as you've talked about, Justin, rather than a sort of a model of catastrophe and restoration. Yeah, and that seems really interesting that is, you know, one of the things which is sort of genuinely distinctive about the Irish Church when you look back at it.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting too, because it ties in with another aspect of contemporary Celtic Christianity that's very popular, which is a connection a lot of people might not realize, which is the connection with the Anam Cara, the idea of an Anam Cara, which means soul friend. And it's easy to think that that means like besties, you know, like a soulmate, perhaps, without the romance or something like that. But really, the way that it was understood in its historical context was as someone who prescribes penance, someone who hears confession, who sits with people, who listens to what's going on with them, and then helps them to find a medicine that will heal their soul. And it's modeled after the desert fathers and mothers who would have ammas and abbas, mothers and fathers, that they would go and sit with and talk about their struggles in prayer and all that kind of stuff. And they would give them something to meditate on or a practice to do. And the Irish very much picked up that tradition. And so the Anam Cara tradition is inextricably woven together with the idea of penance. And it's also what Tony was just saying about the private penance instead of the public penance. It's also the beginnings of that, you know, it's which is kind of cool, because I think in a broad picture way, it means that the Irish Anam Cara tradition is the foundation of what we think of as spiritual direction in the West. It's that move towards private one-on-one conversations instead of public humiliation. It's a move towards a model of penance that's about healing and restoration. And that became, you know, like Tony had said, it was one of the genuinely unique, innovative aspects of historic Celtic Christianity, and it was absorbed into the larger church. So it didn't remain unique. It became taken up in the Western Church as what we think of as a confession today. If you go to a priest and you sit in the booth and you do confession and they give you penance, ultimately, you know, way back when, that goes back to the Anam Caras, which I'm sure in Irish Anam Cara is pluralized differently, but I'm not good with the language. But yeah, so that's just a neat connection to make too, that, you know, it all kind of ties together that way. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very strong and important element in contemporary Celtic spirituality. I'm part of the dispersed neo-monastic community of Aidan and Hilda, which began in the UK, has spread globally. And what really the first step in becoming a vowed member, it's a series of successive, you know, stages to become a fully vowed member. But the first thing is to get a soul friend and to establish that relationship. And I think it's tremendously valuable because it's a form of accountability which isn't strictly institutional or hierarchical, and it's very valuable. I also want to mention some of this. This is, you're not going to believe why this came to mind, but well, since we started, a blackbird came to the window, which is about 5 feet in front of me on the backside of my screen, and sat on the windowsill for a few moments, which is kind of unusual, which reminded me of St. Kevin and the Blackbird, very well-known folk tale, and the Seamus Heaney poem about it and so on. But, you know, the fact that he's stuck there, for the whole long time until the little hatchlings come out in the nest that's being built on his hand. And, it's probably legendary and apocryphal, but it really, I think, I was just thinking about, it's a story about doing penance for love of creation, for the love of another non-human creature. And I think that's sort of a lovely twist to the idea.
Yeah, I do too. And I was actually just reading that story in Kevin recently because I love that story of Kevin. And one of the things, I think his angel comes to him and says, "You don't have to do this, You can put your arms down. You don't have to stay here for the whole of Lent and hold this baby bird in your palm." And Finian turns to his angel and says, "If Christ can die for the whole world, I can suffer for this little bird." Again, a paraphrase. I forget the exact language. And that's just a really cool and beautiful and profound thing to say. That in the same way Christ holds all of humanity, I can hold all of creatures. And I can suffer this little bit for the sake of someone who needs it, for these little chicks who are going to hatch and grow and become new life and go out into the world. It's also interesting on the side note because he argues with his angel, which is just raises all kinds of questions about how do we relate to our angels, but that's maybe a side note.
I mean, that's lovely, isn't it? That in the Kevin story, that his vigil lasts for the period of Lent, and of course that is when eggs are in the nest, and then the fledgling the chicks will just be hatching at this time of year as we're recording this at Easter. That's gorgeous. It sort of makes me. I mean, this whole discussion sort of just brings to mind really about you get the sense as well. I mean, looking at the monastic tradition as a whole, and the Irish tradition in particular, about the asceticism, the ascesis is it's something that kind of goes hand in hand with grace in a way, isn't it? It's almost like the practice, the discipline and the practice is it's a sort of a technology, it's a kind of a means which kind of creates the space where God's work can happen. And I think it's very interesting when you get a feel just the kind of dynamic between what we might do through the practice of self-discipline in terms of actually kind of creating space where the divine, where God's work can actually come in and where grace can happen. And obviously the church has wrestled long and noisily about grace and works, but I think in when you kind of consider what the Irish monks thought that their self-discipline and asceticism was actually achieving, you do kind of see the kind of the human act and the divine act kind of dancing together in the process of sanctification. I think that's this whole tradition, I think, gives a really interesting angle on that.
That the element of grace in there calls to mind too something that I suspect both of you might know more than I do about this, but there's also, besides just do this strenuous thing, there's the healing by opposites, which I believe comes from Cassian, or from the desert originally, and I think Finian refers to it. I'm not sure, but I know that's part of this. I wonder if one of you might want to explicate a little bit more, because that's a very positive healing application.
Yeah, that's one of my jams. So I could do a whole talk on that. It does. Everything you said's right. It comes from the Desert Fathers through Cassian, probably mostly. And it's this idea, the phrase is contraries are cured by contraries. And you see it pop up. I can't remember either if it's in Finian's Penitential. It's definitely in Cummean's and in a number of other ones. Like it's a recurring theme, a core concept in the tradition. And it actually is there because of the medical model, the idea of healing and medicine. And what they've done is, or what they did is they drew from the ancient medical model of humors, where there are different sort of elements in the human body that can become out of balance, and you rebalance them. And so the classic examples are hot and cold and dry and wet. And so if a body, in the ancient model of medicine, if a body was too hot, then they would apply something cold. If it was too cold, they'd apply something hot. If it was too dry, they would apply wet, vice versa. And so there's this idea that by the use of opposites, we can bring balance and harmony back to a dynamic system. Rather than trying to take away the anger, for instance, you add patience, and that helps to balance things out. Yeah, that's probably the short version. But yeah, it's definitely a key aspect of the penitential tradition and of the tradition of an annum caras, is this idea of healing contraries by contraries, identifying the wound and then naming that which is the opposite to it, and then applying that opposite as the medicine. Yeah. Well, I know, Kenneth, you had a couple of topic points for us to discuss as we branch out into the contemporary and medieval dynamic a little bit more. Did you want to, would now be a good time to bring those up?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, one of the things that pops out very frequently on the Celtic Christianity Facebook site is that there's different viewpoints, paradigms, people who have a sense of what Celtic Christianity is in the modern world and what they practice and what energizes them spiritually. For some people, this is very important. They've been part of Christian spirituality that they have experienced as being toxic or harmful to them. And they see Celtic Christianity as an alternative, that and some things that have been really precious and helpful for them. We also are very fortunate in our site to have some real scholars who know the original languages, who get to touch and see the primary documents, and who add to our understanding of what went on in the early Middle Ages and what we now call the Celtic nations. That's it's an anachronism to use Celtic. They wouldn't if they would have called themselves other things in the fourth, fifth, sixth centuries, whatever. But and sometimes there are tensions or misunderstandings or just talking past each other between people and these differing paradigms. And so I have a couple of thoughts about what's going on here to kind of help maybe smooth the waters and understand mutually. One thing that, Justin, you started out today very rightly pointing out the amount of variety then and now. So we talk about the early Middle Ages, and generally the historic discussions on this site roughly vary from the time of Patrick around 400 up to the era of Norman dominance around a little after 1000. So we're talking good 5 centuries at least in time. And further, if we bring in the Carmina Gadelica and folklore of the Victorian era collections and the poetry of Wales and other things, which you can see an organic connection. But so we're talking centuries. And we're talking about a lot of little divided tribes and kingdoms. Also the fact that it was a monastic movement, and the abbots and abbesses were more important in terms of enforcing theological strictures and practices than were bishops or other church hierarchies. So things varied in what monastic order was prominent in a certain region. So there's a lot of variety in the ancient world, and some of these key issues. So what is the role of women in the church? What about predestination and free will? What about eternal damnation? What about the nature of the human soul and consequences for salvation? Big issues. And you can legitimately find a variety of views in the authentic expressions of Christian faith in the insular lands in the early Middle Ages. There was variety. And one of our problems comes nowadays when someone says, well, all the Christian Celts were whatever, they were all universalists. And well, no, some were not. And they had disagreements amongst themselves as we do today. And then you add on to the fact that it is certainly true that the modern expressions of Celtic Christianity they're in an apogee from the ancient, but like you were saying, Justin, even in the ancient world, they were modifying to suit their needs, and we still are today. And I will say this: I've taught comparative religions as a college professor for a decade, and every religious practice, every religious tradition cherry picks their past. It's universal, absolutely. Asian and Western traditions, contemporary practitioners, none of them, there are all certain things they'll emphasize, and they'll practice more than others from their primary documents from ancient times. So again, Celtic Christianity is no different in that. Part of the reason there are different paradigms is because academics and modern day spiritual practitioners often have different source of validation. For scholars, of course, it's documents. It's either what's written or what's an archaeological piece of evidence, an artifact. But artifacts, written or physical, artistic, whatever. That's how we know things. And you can't just say something about the past if you don't have a tangible thing that proves it. And again, I am so thankful for the work of scholars, especially those that know the ancient languages, that translate and make them available for a broader public, or call our attention to where artifacts are in collections and so on. They have so much to contribute. Today, so much of spiritual practice is by people who are spiritual but not religious, and so much is direct experience. For me, one huge contrast between the church of the early Middle Ages and today is that the ancient, what we call Celtic saints and scholars were all very much tied to ecclesial institutions, mostly monastic, but they were connected to institutions, absolutely. I'd say the majority of people I know who call themselves Celtic Christians today, no longer part of a church or a monastic order. And again, I understand there's been abuse, there's been tremendous hurt, and I do not judge that at all. I'm just pointing out the difference. But so people have different sources of what validates their beliefs. So just for one example, one of our scholar contributors, if we're talking about angels, well, they would go to Adamnan's biography of Columba and say, well, what did this writer in the 6th century have to tell us about angels? That's what they believed about angels, and that's great. And a contemporary member might say, I had an experience with an angel. I saw this with my eyes. This happened to me, and that's how I know about angels. And well, each of those is very important to the individual, but it's two different directions in terms of what's real. And I think there needs to be allowance for that, how we each contribute to our faith. Another element I see, this is something I've tried to bring out in my writing and really push, is that many of the elements that people today favor in what they call Celtic Christianity was in fact part of the diversity of Christianity globally in the late classical period and the early Middle Ages. A lot of these things people say, this is so cool that it's Celtic. Yes, it was in the insular lands, And you would find it in Byzantium, and you would find it in Cairo and Alexandria and in Italy, and so on. So just for a quick list, the importance of mystical experiences, the idea that nature is a source of revelation, nature as God's first book, panentheism, the idea that all of reality is within the larger scope of the divine nature, and universalism, the final restitution of all things at the end of time, that all beings will be reconciled back to God. All these things were present, at least, in Christianity, spotted around Christendom in the early Middle Ages. And most everything I just listed was debated, by the way, along with the roles of women and women's rights. All these things were debated in that ancient world. And so, again, they are genuine elements of Celtic Christianity, but they're not exclusively Celtic Christianity. And personally, I think Celtic Christianity was my gateway to falling in love with early medieval Christian faith and its great diversity, and so on. And then the final thing I'd bring up is in terms of what is distinct. And for that, I appreciate this book, Following the Celtic Way, a new assessment of Celtic Christianity by Ian Bradley. And what's fun is he deconstructs the books that he wrote that were more popular, that he wrote and sold earlier. But and it's a pretty massive deconstruction. I'm not sure I go all the way he does, but then he does have a short section where he brings up what he says is really distinctive about insular Christianity in the early Middle Ages. And he says that insular Christianity is distinctively poetic. He says that the Celtic Christ followers adopted the Druidic bardic approach, emphasizing the poetic over the cognitive. He talks about expressions of faith as being lyrical speculations in the light of imagination. He says that this was really a contrast to much of the rest of early Middle Ages Christianity at the time. And he sees a real continuity from the early Middle Ages imaginative and poetic expressions through the folkloric traditions that we see in Ireland and Wales and Scotland, and which are beloved today. And I think this is where I am unabashedly, happy to say that Celtic Christianity was more highly imaginative. And I think it's a great thing. I think the imagination is a terrific gift. And if you look at modern day Christian popularity and apologetics, you see the works of Tolkien and Lewis and MacDonald. You see the love of Mythopia, and, just the celebration of imaginative and poetic expressions of faith, the beauty of faith. And I think that's an element of Celtic Christianity that I always try and bring out to the forefront and say, yes, they imagined these things. Yes, these stories grew and grew and became fantastical. And isn't it lovely? Isn't it delightful expression of our faith? Well, a couple of thoughts. I've gone on. Love to hear your responses.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the poetry, the bardic tradition has such a kind of central place in the Welsh and the Gaelic culture. It's no surprise that did translate across into the expressions of Christianity. And in terms of visual arts, I mean, like the really kind of obvious thing when you think of Celtic culture, is the illustrated Gospels. So you've got the Book of Kells, the Book of Durrow, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and just that sheer exuberance of those manuscripts as pieces of art is, just overwhelming. I mean, they're such beautiful artifacts, and they seem, just kind of very strongly tied to the Celtic places and the Celtic culture. Yeah, and I think I mean you're sort of talking about distinctives there again, and I think jumping off what Bradley's saying, I mean maybe another idea which partly links back to our earlier discussion is just the idea of peregrinato, this kind of the idea of being pilgrims for Christ, being wanderers for Christ. You know, again, you can kind of argue about whether that's kind of unique to the Celtic Church or, but it's certainly strongly associated with those the monks from those centuries. You know, this idea of leaving the clan, you know, leaving the village where you were known and safe and had those ties of blood which would protect you. You know, the people who've got your back, actually kind of choosing to leave those people behind as an act of asceticism, as an act of penance in some cases. You know, it was a huge sacrifice. You were really kind of throwing yourself on the mercy of God to kind of travel to the territory of another tribe and to live there, you know, without the backing of people who were your clan. You know, you'd be there alone and very much dependent on providence, on, you know, God's love and God's mercy to be safe and to thrive there. And yeah, and that is actually you were referring to the Cambrai homily, and that peregrinato is the white martyrdom, isn't it? You know, not the green martyrdom of everyday asceticism or the red martyrdom of actual martyrdom, but the white martyrdom, you know, was that category of self-denial, which corresponds to, yeah, kind of being a wanderer, a peregrinato for the sake of Christ. And yeah, as I say, I mean that's another practice which is very strongly correlated with the Celtic Church.
Yeah, Bradley says if he was going to write another book, it would be something like Christians on the Move, you know, or something. But yeah, and he actually, that is one thing he does say is distinct also, is pilgrimage, walking pilgrimage. There's a quote from an 8th century Italian about how come all the Irish, you know, are overrunning our country, you know, all the pilgrims. And personally, that's become huge in my life. I was very, very fortunate last year to be able to spend 2 full months on the Camino de Santiago from France clear across the top of Spain, and to spend 60 days with pack, with, you know, without an earthly home, just place to place. But it was utterly transformative, and it did sort of reduce life to the elements. I mean, it was where are we going to sleep? Where are we going to eat? And trusting God, you know, to provide that. Probably the most transformative spiritual experience of my entire lifetime. So absolutely great value in peregrination that was a very real part of Celtic spirituality in the early Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's one that interests me. I spent a long time hitchhiking when I was a teenager. So part of me feels like I got my my wandering done before I got into the monasticism. I wasn't doing it for spiritual reasons, but when I look back, I kind of feel like it was spiritual nonetheless. This sort of backpacking, and I lived on the side of the road, and I slept in the park, and I, you know, whatever. And just from my own personal experience, this has nothing to do with the historical text, but for me, it was something that taught me a lot. I did it for a number of years, so it was like it was a way of life for a while. I got kicked out when I was 15, so I just became a nomad and hitchhiked around for 5 years, basically. And I learned a lot about myself and about nature and about God and about other people. Because you encounter all those things in a more sort of raw way when you're a nomadic sort of existence. I learned that when you get cold and wet, that you will also then later become dry and warm again, and it's okay. You know, and that it's okay to be out in the elements and to shiver a little bit and to wake up and sit in the sunlight and warm up. And it almost sort of connects you to the way to our animal nature. I think, you know, we are animals as much as we're also angels. And it connects us, you know, like the deer just lays down in the grass and wakes up in the morning covered in dew and then shakes it off and finds the sunlight and warms up. And so I think there's something about the peregrination that really is a spiritual practice. The ascetic part is definitely what they emphasize in the text. You know, that's definitely their self-defined reason. But I feel like there was probably more to it as well. Not that those things aren't ascetic, because ascetic just means training. As Kenneth was saying before, that's actually where the word comes from. The Greek ascesis means to train in the gymnasium, and so it's to be an athlete, and to train. So I guess it's all asceticism. But anyway, that was just kind of my experience with it. I like the image a lot in a lot of the texts of being in search of the place of your resurrection, and this idea that, you know, they would wander until they would die in some place, and that's where they would be resurrected there. But also the sense that in the wandering, in that you receive a spiritual resurrection. And in the Cambrai homily, it's hard to interpret sometimes. But when I look at the green and the white, or the blue and the white, whatever it might be, it strikes me that they're talking about the inner and outer person, which was common in the Desert Fathers and John Cassian. And so the white martyrdom is this material renunciation, and then the green martyrdom is the renunciation of desires and thoughts, and it's presented, which matches the monastic texts of the desert, that it's a progression, that you begin with the outer person, and then once you've got all that kind of sorted out, then the work of the inner person begins. And so the white martyrdom is the renunciation of material possessions, and then from there we sort of grow. And I like to think that I like green because then it makes it sound like, you know, there's something verdant growing up as we have the inner transformation, the inner resurrection as well. I'm just rambling now. I'm not even sure what topic we're talking about, but that's okay.
There's been an undercurrent in this whole discussion too, which I see personally as a strong element of what we call Celtic Christianity, and that is their ability to synthesize. And in fact, I would argue that much of the beauty of what we call Celtic Christianity is because they did incorporate global elements of their time. They were the great synthesizers. It was weaving it all together in a great knotwork of faith. And so those, you know, the book of Kills has pigments that came from Afghanistan. They proved it chemically. It came from that far away. The Clonmacnoise high crosses have elements that are from pharaonic Egyptian art that were, you know, seen and traveled. And you know, the Ever New Tongue has elements from documents way across the ocean, and on it goes. That, you know, and I think there's sort of this picture of the ancient Irish and Pict as being these isolated people who were, you know, had nothing to do. They were like the Wild West, you know, the frontier. They're cut off from everyone, sort of, you know, simple bumpkins. But in point of fact, they were absolutely connected with global trade routes. They were grabbing every document they could grab and read and translate and share. They were very deliberately incorporating global elements of faith into their own practice and liturgy and beliefs.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And you can see it in the liturgy. I just recently put out a translation of the Prayer of St. Brendan, which is an 8th century text that I worked on with Gilbert Marcus, who is at the University of Glasgow. He did the translation, and I did the introduction and formatted it and that kind of stuff. But anyway, in that prayer, you see this thing that pops up all throughout the early medieval liturgy of using words from other languages, and they were really keen on that, right? So like at the end of a prayer, you'll have a list of like sometimes 10 words, and some of them are Aramaic, some of them are Greek, some of them are Latin, some of them are whatever, and they have this sense that there's something they like to collect, the eclectic language and cultures from around, and that they find some kind of spiritual fruit and benefit in that. And you can see it in the liturgies where it's just like, you'll be reading through, or some of the poetry too. Those prayers of Mucan, I don't know if I'm saying Mucan right, who was one of the early Welsh writers, and he'll end with a bunch of Aramaic words at the ends of his prayers and stuff like that. And they could have easily translated them into their Latin equivalents. Most of these texts are written in Latin. But they didn't. They left them in Greek and Aramaic and all the different languages that they encountered. And I think that does show what you're just saying, Kenneth, that they had this love of the whole world, and this sense that that by becoming Christians, they were connected to the whole world, that it was this global movement, and it was something that united them with the rest of the world, not something that separated them from it. Yeah, so that was
Well, have
that
we
was point
solved
number one. Oh, what was that, Kenneth?
have we solved all the world's problems and brought illumination to all dark corners? I feel like we've covered a lot.
Oh, for sure, yeah. Yeah, I could talk about these things for hours.
We want to segue somehow into what we touched on previously about the role of women in society and the
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah.
sort of role of the feminine. I suppose this came about from sort of contrasting the contemporary spirituality with the historic faith. So, assuming we're taking all of this out, yeah, I'm just thinking back to what you were saying, Kenneth, about those sort of those differences which sometimes manifest between what we call kind of contemporary Celtic spirituality and the historic faith. And you mentioned the role of women and the place of women in society as an example of that. And you do sometimes come across rhetoric about that the Celtic society was kind of egalitarian in the way that society in the Roman Empire was less so. And that's probably quite a good example of something which can possibly be overstated in some of the more kind of popular literature, but then it's maybe sort of doesn't quite stand up to scrutiny when you look at the reality of Irish and Welsh and the other insular society. So yeah, I just wonder if that's worth us circling back to in this conversation.
It's a great example of what you're bringing up, which is we do see, again, discussions, varied perspectives. And yeah, I think so. In Water from an Ancient Well, I was quite positive about the role of women in ancient Celtic society. And I was just actually, we have a preview discussion between the three of us that got me thinking a little more. And so I did look a little bit back. And I think partly this is a thing where I think I can state absolutely objectively that scholars are not all in accord on this matter. And as evidence of that, I mean, I have two books, both of which were written by academics, both of whom, genuine scholars, degreed and credentialed and published. So Mary Condren, The Serpent and the Goddess, she states, and I found the exact quote, Ireland was invaded in pre-Christian times by successive generations of Celts from Northern Europe, a patriarchal people. And it goes on. Condren sees the Bronze Age indigenous inhabitants of Ireland as being truly egalitarian. And then the Celts as coming in, and in the Iron Age before Christianity imposing patriarchy. And then she sees Christianity as brutally imposing patriarchy and so forth. and that's her view. But then Peter Beresford-Ellis, Celtic Women, Women in Celtic Society and Literature, does a very thorough and nuanced view, but he does conclude what you said at the start, Tony, the view that the Celtic early medieval societies, including the early Christian eras, the insular lands were more egalitarian than the bulk of the Roman Empire, and and the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean, and at that time. So people, who've spent who have access to more primary documents and have given it much more attention than I do, differ. So so no wonder we have varying views, and no wonder, quite frankly, we want to hope that the egalitarian perspective was true. It gives us some hope for today.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. I mean, on the one hand, what you just ended with, Kenneth, is so true that, I definitely want it to be egalitarian. Whether or not the medieval Celts were feminists, I am. And, I very much, I grew up Quaker, so like Quakers have had equal rights for women for a few hundred years. And I grew up with that being normal and the way that I view the world. And so it's important to me. And I think it's an important, not just to me personally, but it's important for us as a society that we move in that direction and that we work to undo those injustices, and that we do establish a society and a religious tradition that is egalitarian and doesn't discriminate based on gender in any way. And so that's my beginning. That's where I am in the modern world as a contemporary Celtic Christian. When I read the historical sources, it's tough. There's a lot of different stuff. You can find stories of very strong women leaders. Bridget is the obvious example, but there are others as well. Aita, Hilda, other people. And so it's easy to read those stories and think, wow, look at these strong, empowered women. At the same time, there's also other texts which are less popular because they're not as inspiring, where you find a recurring theme, for instance, in a lot of the medieval Irish texts, that because Eve tempted Adam, that if a religious man spends time around women, he will get tempted and fall into sin. And it's a recurring theme. And I'm sure it's not unique to the Irish text. I didn't mean to imply that. It's just across the board, a global, I should say, a global problem that every culture in the world has struggled with in some way or another. But there is this recurring theme that pops up in a lot of texts. And for instance, Columbanus, when he set out to do his peregrination, his wandering for Christ, the impetus for it was that he went and he visited an old nun who was a hermit who lived by herself. And he said to her that he didn't know what to do. He was sort of overwhelmed. I'm forgetting the exact thing. I'd have to look it up to make sure I have it 100% right. So go read The Life of Columbanus by Jonas Ababio if you want to like pin it down. But the gist of it is that Columbanus was very interested in women. Was very it was something that was one of his inner realities. And this old woman told him, stay away from us. We're all just terrible. And Eve tempted Adam, and if you don't escape from this place, all of these women are going to drag you down, and you're never going to find God. And so he decides in that moment to renounce sexuality, to renounce marriage, and to go out and to wander across Europe, establishing monasteries. And I'm not going to go through them all because they suck, is the truth, but there's numerous examples of things like this. There's also the fact that in a lot of the Brehon laws and the legal texts that we have from medieval Ireland, that women do not have equal status in the legal texts. And so you see a female slave is a common unit of currency for reparations, which is how the legal system was based. It was a reparation system. You do something against me, you pay me a fine to compensate. And that was the way the law worked. And the most common unit of currency is a female slave, which is a sad, terrible reality, but one that's well documented in the text. So anyway, to hold those two things in tension, the way that I like to look at it, and which I find really inspiring when you think about it, is to acknowledge the sort of baseline patriarchal sometimes even misogynistic, going beyond patriarchy into misogyny, social context. But then to see these powerful women, to bring it back to Bridget and to Ita and to all of them, who rise up out of it and who challenge it. And one of my favorite stories, is the story of Bridget being ordained as a bishop. It's one of the later legends or whatever. They're all legends, like Kenneth was saying, it's imaginative culture. But in the story, Bridget decides she wants to be a nun. And she kneels down before a bishop who's going to ordain her as a nun. And then the Holy Spirit fills him, takes over his body, flips the pages to the service for a bishop and ordains her a bishop instead. And then afterwards, he says something to the effect of like, I don't know what just happened, but it was the Spirit. And so Bridget gets to be a bishop, but no other woman ever will be. And that's like what he says in the text. And that last bit gets left off a lot in modern discussions. But it shows this challenge, that there is this patriarchal bishop who doesn't want to ordain a woman as a bishop like himself. And a bishop is much more than a priest. That's a big ordain. But the text presents it as the will of God. Like whatever the Bishop Mel's intention was, the will of God was for Bishop to be for Bridget to be ordained as a bishop. And so when you read it from a literary perspective, because it's a literary work, it seems to me like it's a direct and unequivocal challenge to those things, that maybe the clergy don't want women like Bridget to be bishops, but God does and the Spirit does. So anyway, I like to look and see the struggles of some of these early medieval women and the culture in general, not just the women. You have Adamna or Adumnan, I don't know how to pronounce these words, who was an abbot of Iona, I think the 9th abbot of Iona after Columba. And he wrote a treatise on the protection of innocence, which was primarily about protecting women and children, as well as any non-combatants, clergy and monks and stuff. But the emphasis was on women, and the story is that his mother basically strong-armed him into fixing things and said, like, we're all getting treated really badly here, and until you smarten up, Mr. Powerful Strong Man, and start protecting us, I'm gonna scold you. I can't remember exactly how it goes. She refuses to engage with him as his mother until he changes these things. And then that's an actual law that got passed around and implemented for the protection of women. And so you see, at least from Adamna's perspective, that the advent of Christianity, because he uses Christianity as his sort of basis, is that Christianity is there to liberate the women, which is a pretty cool concept too. So like Kenneth was saying before, there's lots of positions and dynamics and stuff going on in the historical context. And I think if we want to say what, like, Celtic society was perfectly egalitarian, that's not really true, but we can definitely look back and find examples of people seeking equality and seeking justice, and those are real and very much part of the historical texts. And I think lifting those up and denying and rejecting all the other stuff is a perfectly good way for me to go. So I still feel inspired by the historical tradition to move in a feminist direction in the modern world, because I feel like that's the work they began, which just didn't get fully realized the way that it still hasn't been. No. That's my my sermon.
Yeah, I think if you go back to that particular example of the story of Bridget being ordained a bishop, so that's from the Irish Life, is it called, from the 9th century? I mean, it's not contemporaneous with Bridget at all. It's like 400 years after when she might have lived, and as you say, it's very much a literary piece, and you need like a literary analysis of it. And I think with any piece of literature, one of the main questions you ask is kind of, well, why is this story being told in this way at this particular point in time? And I think with that story of Bridget being a bishop, there's probably sort of two different angles on it. It's either kind of rehearsing the legend of Bridget being a bishop, of being a leader in the church, and just really kind of voicing that as a possibility in a culture where bishops and as you say, the priesthood was exclusively male in practice. It was just evoking a female bishop in the person of Bridget as as a figure of imagination at least. And you've got to ask, why is that being done? But then there is a second possibility as well, which you alluded to, was actually the story's being told in the context where the legend of Bridget at that time was that she was a bishop, but it's a kind of a closing the door kind of narrative. It is just saying, well, that was a one-off. There was a particular reason for that. And I'm not sure kind of which, I kind of see as being a more plausible theory there. I think it ties in as well with a very kind of folky kind of popular story, which you write about in your book on Bridget, Kenneth, which is Bridget's mantle. And the story there is that she goes to the local ruler to ask for land to found a monastic community, and it's just kind of brushed off. But then she has a moment of inspiration and goes back and asks if she can be granted enough land, or as much land as her cloak covers. And then there's divine intervention, and the cloak miraculously expands to cover the whole of the Curragh, the whole of the local the plain around Kildare, to become a settlement. There's that sense of divine intervention. And again, that feels like a story that's being told, specifically to lift up the feminine, so the feminine can't be kept down. The God's on the side of the sisters and is going to kind of, lift them up, and the society's trying to keep them down. So, yeah, I mean, you've got to ask with all these figures of, empowered autonomous women, what was the intention behind telling those stories of the 8th, 9th, 10th century?
When this circles back, what you're saying, Tony, circles back to this discussion of, what is Celtic Christianity and where do we derive it from? And a lot of what's been enshrined as modern Celtic Christianity in practice came from folkloric traditions right at the late 1800s, early 1900s. And what was happening there was there really was no glorification or great sense of love for Celtic Christianity until around the turn of the last century. And then you get people like Yeats and Lady Gregory, and because of the rise of Irish nationalism and sense of Welsh nationalism, and so on, these movements are looking back and looking at the good in their traditions. But then at the same time, you have folklorists who are going out in the Highlands, and they're going and listening to the Irish storytellers and the peninsulas and so on. And this is, to me, the fascinating bit is that stories of the saints did pass along person to person among the lower classes in the vernacular for 1,000 years. Their stories were still being told, and of course they transmutated and they become even more glorious, and in some ways they conform to more modern values. But that is another source. You don't just so again, our scholars look back and what really took place historically in Ireland in the time of the saints and scholars, they're going to read early medieval documents. But folklorists were also saying there is a strata of legend that filters down and that really gave oomph to the modern expression of Celtic Christianity.
Yeah, and then in the spirit of talking about the dynamic between contemporary and medieval Celtic Christianity, I think there's something to be said about that folkloric evolution of tradition, which isn't necessarily historical in the way that a modern historian would be, but never has been. And so that tradition goes right back, like the present day historians are reading old legends of oral traditions that changed and adapted and met the needs of their community. And so I think while I very much am super appreciative and sort of reverent, almost in a sense, of a lot of the scholars whose work I'm so dependent on. You know, I couldn't read any of the historical texts I read if they didn't translate them and put together these wonderful introductions and peer review them and do all that like hard work they do just to make it so that I can read the Penitential of Cummean, which wouldn't be possible on my own. But at the same time, there's something to be said for allowing people to remember the past in a way that speaks to the future, just like the stories of Bridget did. You know, in their historical context, the stories of Bridget in the early medieval period were doing this. They were remembering Bridget in a way that speaks to them, to their needs, their present condition, their present time. And sometimes, you know, when I think about contemporary Celtic Christianity and how it often doesn't match necessarily perfectly onto what the historical records show us and what the scholars can tell us what actually happened to the best of their ability, it does match a spirit. Maybe it's the same spirit that turned the pages in the Bishop Mell's book so that Bridget could be ordained. Maybe it's the spirit of the time, or what God is calling us to now. But even though I question whether or not it was a egalitarian society in the past, I still, in my own writing and prayer life, my own personal prayer life, and in the liturgies I write for people in our community and stuff, you know, I lift up Bridget as an example of female leadership and someone that I aspire to be more like, and someone that allows me as a man to sit at her feet and to learn from her. And whether or not that matches what Columban has thought about women, I don't really care, you know, because I think there's something to be said for just letting the spirit move us. And these stories they're history, but they're also something more than that. They're sacred stories that we tell that teach us things and inspire us and move us in directions. And so I just want to make sure that I don't make anyone feel like they can't do that, because I think that's beautiful and good. And go ahead and remember Bridget the way that the Spirit tells you to remember her, because that's what I do too. But,
Amen, Justin. Amen.
well, we've been chatting for a while. Is there anything left that anyone wants to say, or should we start to wrap up? If there's anything left that anybody has on their hearts, feel free to share it.
I appreciate very much being able to be part of this. I've enjoyed this discussion, and I feel like, you know, this is, I hope a good number of people watch this, because I think we covered a number of recurrent things that recur in the Celtic Christianity page, and you know, I think we addressed them quite nicely.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you both for your time, and for also just the way we work together on the site and everything. I really appreciate being able to work with both of you. You're both just such humble and kind and insightful people. So that's something that I appreciate.
Back to you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we'll say goodbye for everyone who's watching. In the description on the YouTube video, we will have some links to Kenneth's work and to our community, where you can find me and Tony doing stuff all the time. And so definitely check out the description for links if this inspired you and you want to learn more things. All right. Take care, everyone.